Last week I forgot to put this out here, and then it was muted. So last week, if anybody was listening online, didn't hear anything. How's everybody doing? Have a good weekend so far? All this great snow. We didn't get much. It hurt my feelings. They're talking more tonight, but it's pretty warm, so it'll just be flurries, if anything. Do what?
I got ice specs yesterday afternoon.
Yeah? Not much. All right, well, we are in Acts chapter 9, and we're getting ready. We're in the first part of talking about Saul. And like I said, Saul is one of my favorite examples, or Paul is one of my favorite examples to talk about. And chapter 9 really just gives us the first look at Paul. We talked about how we've seen him a couple times already before, chapter 7, chapter 8, just a few mentions of him. And I think it was critical that those were brought up. And I think the reason the Holy Spirit had Luke write those down is because of what Paul was going to be in the future. And so we got down to, I think it was verse 3 through 6, wasn't it? We got through 3. Oh, the goads, that's right. All right, so that's verse 5. So we got down to, we're talking about here, and he saw this light. I was reading, again, if you go to Acts chapter 26, Paul recounts what he had happened here. I think it's the first part of 26, if I remember right. It's verse 13. And as he's standing in front of Agrippa, he makes a statement about the light. It says, "At midday, O king, along the road I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining around me and those who journeyed with me." And so, as we talked about, it was at noon, which would have been the brightest time of day, yet this light was still brighter than the sun. And that shone around him. And it was blinding. It was, of course, it caused him to, caused him to be blind with what God had caused his, for his blindness to come. And it shone around him, and he heard a voice. And so that's where we got to, is verse 5. And it says, and he said, or this is what Jesus said to him in verse 4, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he answered, "Who are you, Lord?" Why did Paul say that? Who are you, Lord? Okay, it's a title of respect by saying Lord. Did he know who Jesus was?
It's a question.
No, not personally.
It's a question.
Yeah, it's a question. It's a sign of respect because, of course, it's obviously something miraculous that's happening here, because it wasn't just someone coming up to him and shining a flashlight in his face. This was definitely miraculous. So he understood this was from God, but he didn't know who Jesus was. Yeah.
It'd be like us calling somebody sir.
Yeah, it would be. Exactly. And so he asked that question, "Who are you, Lord?" And the Lord said, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. It is hard for you to kick against the goads." And so he didn't know who the Lord was. And somebody read Acts 22 and verse 6. Like I said, we're going to jump back and forth between these accounts because we get details in the 3 different places. 22 and verse 6.
Now it happened as I journeyed and came near Damascus at about noon. Suddenly a great light from heaven shone around me.
Was that all it? I think that was, I think I wanted a different verse. Sorry. Verse 8, yeah.
So I answered, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said to me, "I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting."
All right, so Jesus, again, we've talked about this many times throughout the first part of Acts. Anytime Jesus is brought up, they state who he was, where he was from. Why was that? Yeah, the title. He was from that area, so it was definitely his heritage. But why else? What's important about saying Jesus of Nazareth? The prophecies. And also it showed that he was God in the flesh, John 1 and verse 14, who had lived, who was there, who died and was resurrected, and now is alive again. And so by Jesus speaking to him, he recognizes this is the man who I've heard of, who is now still alive that we killed. And so he is showing to Paul who he is. And so we already talked a little about this, so we'll pass on it. But there's several verses here, Acts 9:17, 27, 22, 14, that show us that Jesus was seen by Paul. Why was that important? Yeah, as an apostle. And as an apostle, he had to have seen Jesus alive. He had to have seen Jesus resurrected. And 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says he was last seen of me. He was one of the witnesses of Christ. And so not only did he see this light and he heard his voice, but he did see Jesus. He appeared unto him, and several passages show us that. And so Jesus says, why is it hard for you to kick against the goads? The goads, this word means it's a pointy stick used to move cattle or cattle prod. So it's like a cattle prod today. It would be used to move the oxen to get them to go forward, which is, something that we use today. It would not cause the animal to bleed unless they kicked against it. And so in the Hebrew, this would have been something they would have understood. This would have been like a Hebrew phrase, kind of phrases that we use today. And he would have understand that as a Hebrew person. And so it was this idea of him causing pain. And who is he causing pain towards? Well, Christ, but also he was causing pain for himself and what he was doing, because spiritually, what was he doing? Yeah. And so he uses that phrase and tells him that it's hard for him to kick against the goats. So then verse 6, so he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what do you want me to do? And I think that's interesting. Paul recognizes who Jesus is, recognizes what he has done. And I think that's important by the word, two words used there, trembling and astonished. He knew what he had been doing, and he needed to fix it. Something I skipped over this. What would have been perfect timing for something here? What would have been the perfect thing for Jesus to say to Paul here? Would have been the perfect opportunity for Jesus to tell him what he needed to do to get rid of that guilt. Why didn't he do it? Huh? Okay, for one, wasn't ready. What else have we seen with chapter 8 with the eunuch and other examples? Start where they needed to teach, yeah. God always sends a messenger. Yeah, he has a plan. Jesus was not going to tell him exactly what he needed to do. He was going to send a messenger, and that's going to be Ananias. And that's important because, people will say, well, God appeared to me, or God told me something. God told me what I needed to do. I've heard that many times. Sit down and study with somebody. They'll say, well, God told me I'm doing what is right. God doesn't do that. And here is a perfect opportunity for Jesus to tell Paul what he needed to do, and he didn't do it because he sent a messenger.
Paul thought he was doing right.
He did.
So he hasn't even figured out yet that he's on the wrong path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think by this light and Jesus appearing to him, I think he was now recognized he's done something wrong. And I think that's important by the words used in verse 6, and then we're going to see his demeanor after this. He's definitely sorrowful for what he had done. Nope, he didn't. Nope, he didn't. And so he was going to send a messenger to him. So then verse 6, somebody read Acts 22 and verse 10.
And I said, what shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, rise and go to Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do.
Okay, you have the ESV, don't you? So, no, I want you to go back to Acts chapter 9 and read verse 6 for me, please.
But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do.
All right, so the first part of this verse is added. Verse 6 says, so he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what would you want me to do? That's what the New King James says. The King James also says that. ESV doesn't. Remember, we've talked about this. This happened in chapter 8 also. That was a phrase. It was not in the original text. Now, chapter 8, depending on what manuscript you read, the Textus Receptus or the Westcott and Hort, they had that verse in there, verse 37. But in this verse, none of the transcripts have that. It was a phrase that was added. But when you look at Acts 22 and verse 10, it's there. So, yeah, it shouldn't have been added here, but it's applied later in chapter 22 by what Paul said. And you'd read from the ESV from chapter 22, and it's there. And so just something interesting, because you'll see that, and ASV is the same way. I think the ASV doesn't have that either. Yep, because they're the same. ASV and ESV use the same Westcott and Hort manuscripts. But this part is implied with his reaction. I think that's why it's here. And then also in chapter 22, it is stated. But we have those two words, trembling. The word trembling means to quake with fear. And so we're getting a picture of Paul's demeanor now that he has realized what he's doing, what he had done, and what he's been doing to Christ and to the church. He's quaking with fear. He is scared for his life. Not only his life, but he thought he was living righteously with God and what he was doing. He thought he was living right. And now he's starting to quake with fear. The word astonished means to stupefy. Not a word we really use. But he was amazed. He was awestruck. What he saw and what he understand what he's doing, it caused him to just be scared for his life.
So when he uses the word Lord in this verse, he is addressing Jesus specifically.
Yes. Yep, he is. He knows who he is now and what he has done. And so what does Jesus tell him? Arise, go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. Paul was told to go into the same city that he was going to wreak havoc, wasn't he? He was headed to Damascus. He was ready to grab them. I'm sure people knew that. I'm sure people heard about what Paul was doing. Later on, Ananias says that I've heard what Paul has been doing to the church. They knew what Paul was doing. Now he's going to the same city that he was going to wreak havoc, and he's going to wait for Ananias. And like I said, this would have been the perfect time for the Lord to tell him what to do, but he doesn't. Now, what does Paul, and when we look at the steps of salvation, what does Paul have here? What parts of the plan of salvation have Paul, he believes, he's heard, he's believed, he has faith in Jesus, right? Is he repentant? I think he's getting to that point. We're going to see that more in the next part when we're looking at Paul. Verse 7, let's look at verse 7. And the many who journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no one. Then Paul rose from the ground. When his eyes were opened, he saw no one. And they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And he was 3 days without sight and neither ate nor drank. Why would a person, if he was saved through faith and belief, not eat for 3 days? Could have been poison. If a person doesn't eat or drink for a long period of time, what does that say about them? Okay, there's something going on. They're sorrowful, they're upset. This was not a person that was joyful. This was a person who was in sorrow. So he believed, he had belief in Jesus, he had faith in Jesus, and I'm sure he was very repentant of what he had done, knew what he had been doing because now he was been told. But he wasn't saved. Not saved yet at all. And so, yeah, he didn't say the sinner's prayer. And that, yeah, that's what it is. He was praying, but he wasn't praying the right prayer. Exactly. This is 100% faith only, sinner's prayer. This is definitely a nail in the coffin to it. Because for one, we don't see the sinner's prayer at all in scriptures. You cannot find it. And then for two, he was praying. What would he have been praying? We're not told. What would he have been praying about? Just think about this. It's implied here. Would he have been praying that, for his food, for whatever? No. What's he praying about? Please forgive me of this. It's kind of the idea of Psalm 51. After David had sinned against Bathsheba, you have Psalm 51, which is him asking for that repentance. That could have been very similar to what Paul is doing here. He's going, I have done so much terrible things. We've talked about Paul and how it has bothered him so much of what he had done. He brings it up many times throughout most of his books. He is praying for forgiveness, and it's still not forgiven him yet, because if he knew that praying and asking God for forgiveness at this point was going to save him, he would have been joyful after that, knowing that guilt was gone. But he's not. We're going to see he is later. And sorry. And so Paul goes into the city, and he is told that he would have someone meet him. And so verse 6, the last part of verse 6, I've got a couple other things here. It kind of brings up a question. Why was Paul so special that Jesus would have appeared to him?
Conviction he had for things.
Okay. He had zeal for his conviction. What else?
He was a Jew.
Okay.
He was a high-ranking Jew.
Mm-hmm.
And people would trust him and believe him.
Yeah. He was very intelligent. And so, and being a high-ranking Jew, people would trust him. Not only that, but somebody read 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 1. Do what? He was a Roman, yes. He was a Roman citizen because of where he lived. Yep. Yep.
Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus, Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord?
Okay, and then we go back to chapter 9 of Acts, verse 15 and 16. Somebody read that.
But the Lord said to him, Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel. For I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake.
Paul was a chosen person. God chose him for a purpose, for a reason. And that he was going to become an apostle. He was going to be an apostle to the Gentiles. And so for him to be that apostle, to be able to do that, Jesus had to appear to him. And so why is it that Paul was special, and why does not the Lord appear to other people today? Well, because Paul was a chosen person. Paul was a chosen vessel for that. This is not going to happen today. We're not going to have Jesus appear to us and wake us up and say, oh, you're doing what is wrong. We need to fix that. This was just a special occasion of what we see happen to Paul here because of who he was going to be for the Lord. And as we already talked about, 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 8, he was the last one to see Jesus alive. And he was that witness. And so he was chosen to be a minister of the gospel to the Gentiles. Somebody read Acts 26, 14 through 18. Here again, this is when he's standing before Agrippa. Acts 26, 14 through 18.
And when we all had fallen to the ground, I heard a voice speaking to me and saying in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. So I said, Who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But rise and stand on your feet, for I have appeared to you, appeared to you for this purpose, to make you a minister and a witness both of the things which you have seen and of the things which I will yet reveal to you. I will deliver you from the Jewish people, as well as from the Gentiles, to whom I now send you, to open their eyes in order to turn them from darkness to light, for from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and inheritance among those who are sanctified by faith in me.
All right, so that is a more expanded version of what we read here. Why was Paul chosen? He was chosen to be a minister to the Gentiles, to wake them up, to open their eyes to the truth. And Jesus even said there, I appeared to you for this reason, specific reason. And so there's not going to be a moment in someone's life where God appears to them, or Jesus appears to them, or an angel appears to them to tell them they're doing something right or wrong. This only happened here with Paul for a reason. And so I think that's important, because I've had people tell me, they didn't say Jesus appeared to them, but they've said an angel appeared to them, or something along those lines. It told them they needed to do something different. We need to recognize this was only for a reason. So, all right. Any questions on that?
It's hard to get people to understand that was something that happened in the first century.
Mm-hmm.
You have to teach that part of it too, and it
Yeah.
helps to make sense for them.
It is. It is. The things were a lot different then. And when we get to looking at 1 Corinthians 13, those miraculous things don't happen anymore for a reason. We have this. Paul was a part of that foundation of the church. Him and the rest of the apostles were in the building of the foundation, 1 Corinthians 3, so that we can build our faith upon the truth. And that foundation is already built. It's here. We build upon that. And so there is no need for the miraculous anymore. So, all right. So then we get to verse 7 and 9, or 7 through 9. We're told that the men journeyed with him, stood speechless, hearing a voice but seeing no one. It's from Acts 22 and verse 9. Lauren, would you be able to read that one? Because there's a word used there. 22 and verse 9.
Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me.
All right, so the ESV used the word understand, and that's a better use of the word there. And I think the ASV does also. But they saw the light, but verse 7 it says they hearing a voice but seeing no one. Here, what they did is they couldn't understand what was. They heard a voice, they couldn't understand it. Paul was the only one that could understand it. And this was similar to what happened to those around Jesus. We're not going to read it, but John chapter 12, 28 through 29, the same thing kind of happened there. Those that were around him did not understand what was being said. And so that's what happened here. But Jesus only appeared to Paul and only spoke to him. And so then verse 8. Then Saul arose from the ground, and when his eyes were open, he saw no one. And they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. Some doctrines out there, this is just a little minute detail, but they'll say, well, Paul was on a horse. And he rode his horse into Damascus. And why, I don't know, but that's a detail that some would like to add to this. But it says here that they led him by the hand. So they were walking. And we talked about this, the distance between Damascus and Jerusalem. it was a long, long journey. And where they were at in that journey when this happened, we're not told. But they led him into the city by hand to this house because he was blinded by the light. And verse 9 says, and he was 3 days without sight and neither ate nor drank. Somebody read 2 Corinthians 7 and verse 10.
You wonder about the men that were with him too.
Yeah. They were Jews. The men that were with him were assisting him in the things that he was going to do. He was not going to be able to do them on his own. He was going to need help. That's a good point. I never thought about that. They didn't see Jesus, they didn't hear his voice, but they saw the miraculous things happen. And not only that, they're more than likely going to hear the gospel from Ananias also, if they're still with him, which I would say they probably are. So yeah, didn't think about that. 7:10.
For godly sorrow produces repentance leading to salvation, not to be regretted, but the sorrow of the world produces death.
All right, so this is a time of reflection for Paul. If you read verse 11 and on in 2 Corinthians, it talks about what true repentance is. Paul had that. I think he had this repentant heart of what he had done. He had a time of reflection to think about what he had went to. If believing was all he had to do, then why was he sorrowful? Why was he 3 days not eating, not drinking? Why was he 3 days and praying? He was sorrowful. And so he was not saved at this point. So now, verse 10. Somebody will read verse 10 through 19.
Now there was a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias, and to him the Lord said in a vision, Ananias, and he said, Here I am, Lord. So the Lord said to him, Arise and go to the street called Straight, and inquire at the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus. For behold, he is praying, and in a vision he has seen a man named Ananias coming in and putting his hand on him so that he might receive his sight. Then Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priest to bind all who call on your name. But the Lord said to him, Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel. For I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake. And Ananias went his way and entered the house, and laying his hand on him, he said, Brother Saul, the Lord of Jesus, who appeared to you on the road as you came, has sent me that you may receive your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. Immediately there fell from his eyes something like scales, and he received his sight at once, and he arose and was baptized. So when he had received food, he was strengthened. Then Saul spent some days with the disciples at Damascus.
Sorry, I thought I forgot we were past what you guys had in the handout. Sorry. So we're looking at now. Saul is repentant of what he had done. He is 3 days waiting for Ananias, and now verse 10 we get to learning about Ananias, and the Lord appears to him and speaks to him. God instructs Ananias to go minister to Saul. And what's interesting there, in this first part, he doesn't tell Ananias what he is to tell Saul. He just tells him to go to him and heal him so that he could receive his sight. McGarvey makes, which is a commentator, makes an interesting comment about this. It says, it will be observed that in these directions, the Lord does not tell Ananias what to tell Saul to do. The omission only proves that Ananias already knew perfectly what such a person should be told to do, and corresponds with the fact that the things in which he was instructed were the things appointed for him to do. What McGarvey is saying is that when the Lord told him to go to Saul, he knew what he was to tell Saul. He was to preach him the gospel. He didn't need to be told, you need to tell him how to become a Christian, things like that. Ananias already knew when he was instructed, just like Philip was when Philip was told by the angel to go to a certain place and to meet this eunuch. He understood what the mission was, and that was to tell him the truth. And so by this point, Saul had believed, he repented. I think he'd also confessed Christ, hadn't he? He knew who Christ was. Maybe not and he had stated and even said, I know who you are, Lord. He called him Lord. But that was not all that he needed to do. He still had other things to do. And I think this is interesting. Let me read Romans chapter 5 and verse 1. This is Paul later writing about faith, which there's a lot more in the context of Romans chapter 5. You got to read chapter 4 to get all of this. But somebody read Romans 5 and verse 1.
Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ.
Okay, some would say, well, being justified, what does it mean to be justified?
Just as I've not sinned.
Yeah, the best way to say it is justified, not sinned. And so Paul says in Romans 5 and verse 1, a person is justified by faith. Now, some would say, well, that means all a person has to have is faith.
No.
Exactly.
Faith leads you to follow the steps that you were given.
Yeah. If that was correct, then Paul's own life here was wrong in what happened here. Because did he have faith? He did. Was he justified yet? No. He was sorrowful, right? So, and like I said, Romans 5, you go back into chapter 4, that is really just the end of what Paul is talking about in chapter 4. And he talks about Abraham. Abraham was justified by his faith. But Abraham was obedient in his life. And so his faith in God caused him to be obedient and to obey God and to live righteous. And therefore he was justified. So it's his faith that led him to do what he needed to do. And that's what's going on here. Paul's faith is leading him towards fixing his life and becoming a Christian and being baptized. And so Paul, and notice, and also Romans 5 verse 1, the other thing I wanted to point out for there, Paul said there's a peace that comes with being justified, right? Was Paul at peace? Again, no. He was not at peace. He was praying. He was not eating for 3 days. That does not give me the picture of someone that is at peace with God, who is fasting, who is praying, who is sorrowful. Paul had everything he needed except the message here from Ananias and what he needed to do to remove his sins. One of my instructors had this quote, and it was from this man DeWelt here. It says, conversion takes place in the sinner's mind, but forgiveness takes place in the heart of God. I think that's interesting. We do what we can, but then we have to go down to that watery baptism where God forgives us for that sin. And so Paul was told Ananias would meet him here. Ananias is now speaking to the Lord. And so verse 11, it says, so the Lord said to him, arise, go to the city called Straight, and inquire at the house of Judas for one called Saul Tarsus, for behold, he is praying. And that's what we're told that he is praying. Now, Ananias is reluctant to do this, isn't he? Why would he be reluctant? He's scared. He knew. So verse 12, he's told that Ananias, he told Paul, or he has shown to Paul that Ananias would come to him. So then verse 13, Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. So Ananias has not had this happen to him. Paul has not interacted with Ananias before. He's not been persecuted by Paul, but he has heard of the things that Paul has done. And so he is reluctant to go to him, it's interesting because you have the Lord speaking to him, telling him to specifically do this. He's still reluctant. I think that's human nature. Because he knows what Paul's like, and it's hard for him to see Paul could change. Think about that. Out of all the things that Paul was doing in his life, he was murdering Christians, he was persecuting. We've talked about how he was murdering them. He was dragging them to prison. To a normal person, would it be hard to believe Paul could change? That's why I love the example of Paul. Because we sit down with guys in the jail, and they'll say, I have done so many terrible things in my life. And I say, you know what? Let's talk about Paul. Because Paul did, we have talked with people who have killed someone down there. But for the most part, we think killing is the worst thing a person can do. A lot of people think that. Paul did all of these things. And then I take them to 1 Timothy chapter 1, where Paul talks about how he found grace. He found salvation. He found God's mercy. And he's a great example of one who could find forgiveness in God. And so it shows the power of the gospel.
I think the key word there is that he found it because he was looking for it. And for if you're in a jail, that would be something that changed their mind. They need to be looking for it,
Yep.
not just letting life happen to them.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to search. And so, yeah,
If they want to find it, I guess.
it is. God has given everybody the opportunity. I think we talked about that in our sermon last week. God has given all opportunities. No one's going to be able to stand before God on Judgment Day and say they didn't have an opportunity. Whether it be through someone speaking to them having a Bible. Almost everybody in the world has a Bible. Not everybody, but most people do or have access to it. Or have heard a message from someone about the truth. The opportunity is there. And Paul had this opportunity, and he grabbed a hold of that opportunity first thing he had it. And so he was reluctant. He was reluctant because of heard of the things that had happened. Something interesting before we move on. This is the first time the word saints is used in reference to the church, to Christians. Ananias here uses that phrase, your saints in Jerusalem. It's the first time we see that used. And so in verse 14 it says, and here he has authority from the chief priest to bind all who call on your name. He understood and already heard what Paul was able to do to Christians. And so verse 15, the Lord said to him, go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel, for I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake. He was reluctant, but God assures Ananias that Saul was going to listen. And we've already read this, but Acts 26, verse 14 through 18 gives us a more expanded version of what was told here because of what was told to Paul. But he was going to be a minister of God to the Gentiles. But notice verse 16. I will also show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake. Paul did a lot of havoc to the church, caused the church to spread throughout the world, killed many people. Jesus says, I'm going to show him what he's going to have to suffer now for his name's sake. Did Paul suffer? We're about out of time. Let's read one passage. Somebody read 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23 through 28.
Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I have more, and labors more abundant, and stripes above measure, and prisons more frequently, and deaths often. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I've been in the deep. In journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness, often in hunger and thirst, in fastings, often in cold and nakedness. Besides the other things What comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches.
All right. This gives us a picture into Paul's character. When he saw something to be truth, he puts his 100% all into it. He did that before he became a Christian. Once he became a Christian, he didn't let anything stop him. He knew what the truth was. He knew what he needed to do. He didn't let anything stop him. Even to where he was proclaimed dead by being stoned, cast out of the city, and stood back up and went on. Paul continued moving forward, continued to preach the gospel. And so it gives us a picture into his character. Very zealous, very determined person. And he was going to suffer, and he did. He suffered a lot for the truth. All right, we're out of time. We'll pick up here next week. I want to talk